Hello, Montana. Hello, world. Chris Hislop here from the Montana World Affairs Council. Welcome to another session in our International Careers Week. Over the years, we've met with a lot of students, a lot of community members with our Distinguished Speakers program, and over, we get a similar question, which sounds something like, how did you get the job that you do? So in order to answer that for our students around Montana, we've gathered an extraordinary array of international experts from journalism to the military to humanitarian affairs and the UN who are coming to you all week to share a little bit about their professional experience and what it means to do the work they do and how you might consider that kind of work. So if you're interested in the international world and in an international career, this is the place to be. If you've missed any of our previous programs or can't get any in the future, they're all on our YouTube channel, so you can check them out there. Let me just give a very quick thanks to our generous sponsors at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, First Interstate Bank, Trail West Bank, QFI, High Stakes Foundation, and Longview Foundation. They help us bring this and so many more programs to you. Now let me introduce our distinguished guest. This is Matt Volz. He's the editor of KHN's health care news coverage of the Mountain West and is based in Helena, Montana. He was previously an editor on the Associated Press's international desk in New York, a public information officer at an NGO in Kosovo in the Balkans, which is, by the way, where Matt and I met and worked together, and he's taught English as a Peace Corps volunteer in Lithuania. Matt, greetings. Are we catching you in our fair state's capital today?
I'm right here in Helena. Thanks for having me on, Chris. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, we're really glad you could come, Matt. I know all about you and your experience. And one important part of this week is that we have a really diverse group of people, not just their professions, but kind of where they are now. Oftentimes we think about an international career as something you must do outside of the United States, but we're learning very quickly that in fact, one can be engaged in the world and be here in Montana or in the United States or otherwise. So it's an interesting part of this week to learn more about how one can do that. But Matt, you have had a long and very interesting career. I mentioned just now that we met in the Balkans in 1998-99 during the Kosovo War, and you went on from there to do any number of very interesting things. We're hoping you might share a little bit of your perspective on your international work, what that's meant to you, and maybe give some of our participants a little bit of advice on how they might do the same. So over to you.
Thanks, Chris. And like I said, I'm very excited to be here. And you're absolutely right how the world, you don't have to go out in the world for the world to affect you. And we could just look over in the skies this past week at the Chinese balloon that was over Montana and see how, even when you're just not paying attention, the world will come to you. And it's important to know what's going on. So I caught the very end of the last speaker, General Wesley Clark, and let me tell you, that's a very hard act to follow. If the students here didn't see that, he's a very inspiring leader, and if you were listening, if you weren't listening, go back and see the YouTube channel. He has some great advice, particularly about taking risks. However, very few people have the ability to influence world events on the scale that General Clark did. And I am certainly not one of those people. I'm an unknown reporter and a mere mortal, lucky enough to be talking to you between the NATO Supreme Allied Commander and lunch. So if you're a mere mortal like me who's interested in international affairs and wants to make a difference, well, you could do a lot worse than a career in international journalism, because you get the chance as a mere mortal to witness the effect of the actions of world changers like General Clark. You get to tell the world about what they do, and once in a while you get to hold them accountable for the things that they're doing in your name. So as Chris mentioned, I was lucky enough to live, work, and write in the Balkans. for a while, also in Lithuania with the Peace Corps, and in Russia, and on the AP's international desk. And I was there when Afghanistan and Iraq wars were at their peak. But just for a moment before I get into all that, I want to bring it back to Montana, where I've been the editor and reporter for the past 13 years. So you see behind me this painting. I bought this painting about 10 years ago at the Montana Newspaper Association auction. And it's titled An Interview, and it's by a guy named Jack Roberts. And here you'll see, if you can't see it clearly, it shows a Native American man telling his story to a reporter who's scribbling it down as fast as he can on a notebook. They're on a boardwalk in the middle of an old west town, and there's a group of guys looking on as he's telling his story. So as you know, Native Americans then were subject to racism and marginalization as their lands were taken, and they fought the erasure of their culture. Some would argue that it hasn't gotten a whole lot better since then. So when I look at this painting, I imagine that some sort of conflict has just happened between the Native Americans and the white guys over here in the side of the painting. And this reporter, he's doing his job in making sure the voice is heard of this man who might not normally get a chance to tell his story. The reporter is empowering the person to tell his story confidently in front of these other men, despite the potential intimidation their presence might have, or the ridicule that I imagine they're heaping on him. So to me, this painting, the reason I'm going into this, the painting shows what journalism is, or what it should be at its best. And that's to amplify the voice of the underdog and the underprivileged. And that's my North Star. And that's why I've been in this field for 25 years now. And so while that's an imaginary scene from the Old West, it's a truism that definitely applies to international journalism. At their best, international journalists help shine a light on some of the darkest corners of the world. And yeah, that means war. And it's probably the first thing you think about when you think of a foreign correspondent, just covering the wars. But it's also covering natural disasters and the effects of climate change on people's lives and on ecosystems like the Amazon rainforest that affect the future of the world, really, the world's lungs. Is watching international businesses to make sure that they aren't promoting exploitation or even slavery of local workers just to feed the supply chain of products to the United States. And it's following the actions of repressive and corrupt governments whose leaders might be personally enriching themselves on the nation's natural resources and leaving their people in poverty in the meantime. It's heavy stuff and it matters. But the coverage of the US coverage, at least, of international affairs is shrinking and consolidating. So the news industry has just been declining for years. It's in bad shape. We weren't able to get the transition from newspapers to the internet right, and they're paying the price now, still figuring it out. And so for most news outlets, the International Bureau was the first cost to be cut as an expense that they just can't afford. So that means, there was this path of becoming an international correspondent where you earn your chops at a domestic bureau, put your time in at the foreign desk, and then get a plum assignment somewhere in a foreign bureau. And that really just doesn't exist anymore. So there are some paths like that, but they're few and it's really competitive. So, but that doesn't mean there's not the need and there's not the demand. It just means you have to kind of figure it out yourself and getting out there to do it. So my story briefly, the first newspaper article I ever wrote was a firsthand account of riding the Trans-Siberian Railway. I had just finished a 2-year stint with the Peace Corps in Lithuania, as that country was struggling to transition from a Soviet republic to an independent democracy. And as Chris knows, the Peace Corps gives volunteers a bit of cash after their service to help them transition back to life in the US. Most everybody, and me included, decide to blow it on a big trip before going home. And so I traveled overland from Moscow to Hong Kong by rail, bus, and even hydrofoil in southern China. And so this first story came out of my journal. I offered the Times-Picayune of New Orleans, my hometown is New Orleans. I offered them the story saying, I don't want any money, I just want to see my name in the paper. But they took it and they paid me $200. And so I was hooked from then on. So I knew I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I love the international stuff. I got, that adrenaline from selling a news story. That's what I wanted to do, but I knew I needed to learn the trade. So I spent a couple years working at small Louisiana newspapers, learning kind of trial and error. How do you find stories that matter to people? How do you conduct interviews, and how do you write? And let me tell you, writing is the worst. It's so hard. I hate it today. You have to take these complex subjects that, you usually get people mad if they're really important. And you have to break it down into short stories that are not only understandable, but are interesting to people who maybe never come across it before. And you have to get it right. And you have to do this in a very short time frame. And that is really hard stuff. So I did that grind for about 2 years at the local newspaper, and I thought I was ready. All right, I want to go overseas. But to my surprise and chagrin, the New York Times didn't come calling. So I decided I had to force the issue. I joined Chris, the NGO that Chris was a part of in Kosovo. I went in country right after the NATO intervention, and I was there as a public information officer, talking about, well, my main job was sending out press releases and giving interviews about the work that the organization was doing, providing food and aid to our the people we were serving in the western part of the province. I think there were something like 370,000 people. I got to travel extensively throughout the area and seeing the recovery efforts and talking to the people. And so in that way, I became kind of what's known as it wasn't my official job title, but I became a kind of a fixer, which is an important piece, a component of international journalism. And I drove reporters from NPR and the BBC and the Salt Lake Tribune and all kinds of others to find stories for them and to find the people who tell them. And one time, Sylvia Poggioli from NPR walked into my office with an Italian radio journalist. They were holding up a newsletter that I had just put out with a story about a family of women whose husbands and fathers had been killed by Serbs during the war. They were spending the winter in their bombed out roofless home with their kids with only a wooden stove for warmth. And so Sylvia Poggioli from NPR came in and said, take me to these people. And so I grabbed the program manager for a local ethnic Albanian who could translate and explain, and gave them a tour of the village and set up interviews with the women and other villagers around there. So that's a fixer, and a fixer is an unsung but essential role. They have the on-the-ground expertise to connect foreign correspondents with their stories, and it's a way for a young person just getting into the field to kind of break in. And so anyway, I'm going on too long. Let me wrap it up. After Kosovo, I enrolled in Columbia University. They gave me the chance to go in the journalism school, they gave me the chance to go to Russia and the Ukraine to report on how religion had evolved in those countries after the end of the Soviet Union. And so then when I graduated, I hit a crossroads. There was an English language daily in Moscow that was offering me $35 a shift to be an editor while I worked on my Russian, after which they'd bring me on as a full-time reporter. I had a job offer as a temporary reporter with the Associated Press in Mississippi. And then the NGO I worked on with in Kosovo offered me a job in Afghanistan, where the war had just started in 2002. So I had a talk with my advisor, as a man named Seymour Topping. He was a New York Times foreign correspondent, and at the time the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes. I asked him what I should do, and he gave me the best advice possible, and it's really the message that I want to leave you with. And it's, he said, go while you have the fire in your belly. I did not take his advice. So I was attracted to the AP. I wanted to earn my chops to become a big foreign correspondent with a major wire service. So I'd work my way through domestic bureaus up to the international desk, where I was a supervising overnight editor, filing copy in New York. So as the sun would rise across the world, my duties would go from Japan to China to Afghanistan to Iraq, and then over to Europe. And then, by the time Europe was getting going, it was the end of my shift. And I did that every night. It was just amazing to see just the world wake up in that way. But after a little while of doing that, I came across another crossroads. So I had the option of an offer to move with the AP to Bangkok, where I would be an editor on the Asia desk there, covering China and all of Southeast Asia. Another option was to become a correspondent in AP's Moscow bureau. And then my third option was becoming an AP correspondent in Montana. And this is where Professor Topping's words come in: go while you have the fire in your belly. I was 36 years old when this crossroads came, and I had just gotten married and was looking to start a family before it got too late. And my wife and I visited Helena, and it didn't take very long to realize that this would be a much better place to start and raise a family than Moscow or Bangkok. And so we've been here ever since, and honestly, I've never looked back. So, anyway, that's my story, and some time has passed since I've been on that international track. So I looked up, like, what are news organizations looking for in a foreign correspondent today? So if you go to something like ap.org, you'll see some job descriptions. I found one for a Chinese correspondent, and it will give you kind of an idea of what they're looking for. So their Greater China correspondent, which would cover China, Taiwan, Macau, Hong Kong. So they aim to consistently break news, ensure the speedy filing of urgent spot developments. You must be a self-starter who can generate ideas that resonate in Asia and around the world. You have to work any shift, including nights and on weekends, because AP is a 24/7 operation. 24/7 operation. So you have to have demonstrated excellence as a journalist covering a complex and challenging beat with a deep record of delivering enlightening and distinctive stories. You have to have at least 5 years of full-time experience at a daily paper or broadcast station. You have to have extremely tight deadlines. You have to speak Mandarin, and you have to have professional competency of other skills. So these aren't jobs for beginners, right? You got to know about the country. You got to know the language. You need to have experience that proves that you can report the news of the world. So here's just the takeaway, and I'll leave it to Chris and any questions afterwards. If you're interested in a career of an international journalist, first, you're going to have to make your own path, most likely, in which you build your skills as a journalist and also build your skills in language and culture and the history of a region. So think about what country or region interests you and where you can really dig into learning the history, culture, and language. That's going to set you apart from other reporters and give you an advantage in reporting from that region. But at the same time, you also need to make sure you're up to speed on general understanding of international news. So read religiously The Economist, the BBC, the AP, Reuters, the New York Times. Just learn about what makes the international world tick and the interconnectedness of it all. But then you got to build your skills. So, when you're in college, get some internships during the summer that let you report and write and build that experience. Or you do what I did and wait till graduation and get a job at a local paper that doesn't pay you anything if you can afford it. And you could, but there you get to cover everything and do all kinds of jobs. It can be a really big fish in a small pond, and you get amazing experience that way. And then after you built that foundation of skills, go while you have the fire in the belly. Important thing, find someone who will pay your way to get you in that country and help you advance your training. The Peace Corps, NGO work, that's going to has the added benefit of smoothing over any visa skills. Because if you go somewhere to report on a tourist visa and start working, you run the risk of getting kicked out if they find you. But at the very least, you have to leave every 30, 60, 90 days and have to come back in. But if you're working with an NGO or Peace Corps, and Peace Corps is great because in exchange for a 2-year commitment, you get excellent language training, you get in-country support, you're really taken care of, and you're really able to get to know a country, a region at a level that few people do. So when you get in country, network, get to know the journalism community, see who needs fixer or freelancer work, see if you can write a quick story or for somebody, or get a job with the local English paper, see if they'll offer shifts like the Moscow Times offered me, see if the AP is making local hires. Just be willing to do any kind of job that enmeshes you into that journalism community. You become a known quantity. It's such a small world that, smart, willing, and capable journalists, there's always going to be a place. So, and just last thing, go where you have an interest, but be smart about it, right? Don't just buy a one-way ticket to a war zone. Read the State Department advisories and be aware of any safety issues that are going on in that country. Don't go into a war zone if you're a solo freelancer without the support of an organization. You probably won't be able to crack in anyway. The better bet, if you're interested in war correspondence, is to start like in the nearest support city, like Skopje was in Kosovo, or Amman to Iraq, or God forbid, Bangkok if this Taiwan thing becomes bad. And just remember what Professor Topping said, just go while you have the fire in your belly.
Oh, that was good. Matt, there's a lot of meat there, a whole lot of meat in that presentation. Thanks a lot. And not surprisingly, the students at Bozeman High School are punching in a lot of questions. And we have maybe 15, 20 minutes max. So you're going to have to abbreviate your answers here a little bit on a long list of questions that have been chatted into me. So here they come, fast and furious to you, Matt. First one is, how does the language barrier affect your work?
It can, but that's where a fixer comes in. When you get on the ground, you can. The wonderful thing is that you have so many tools now, from Google Translate to Siri and that makes it a lot easier than it did just 10, 20 years ago. But the key thing is to have somebody who is on the ground with you, who knows. If you don't know that language and you don't know that culture, so many things can be misunderstood, misinterpreted. And if you're writing something for world consumption, you want to make sure that those cultural and language mishaps are just, you eliminate them. So find a fixer, or else start from the beginning and become a fixer. And you're going to have your own incredibly deep knowledge after amount of time. And it takes a lot of time to get to that level. But it's an investment that's well worth it, especially if you're really passionate about it.
Matt, how do you deal with countries that don't have or have minimal freedom of the press?
That is that's a tricky one. I can give you an example of Russia before this war with Ukraine. For international reporters had something of a luxury compared with domestic reporters. In authoritarian regimes, they tend to care more about what the domestic press is putting out as opposed to the international press, because they want to be able to control potential unrest in their own countries, and their countries are more attuned to the domestic press than the international press. That said, there are a lot of stories about censorship and intimidation of foreign journalists in places like China and Russia. And I think it's hard right now to be an international journalist in Russia. And North Korea is a very big example of where there's basically no international presence. So in short, You have to maintain your journalistic standards, and that it's absolutely a no-go that anybody can edit your copy or change your copy as part of government that you're covering. And that might run you crosswise with some governments, in which case, in extreme cases, you might have to leave that country, and you might have to do your reporting nearby from a place that does have the freedom of the press. But in a lot of places, if you have a large news organization that can back you up, that's some good muscle that you can have to maintain your reporting integrity.
Matt, here's another question, and I'm going to kind of extend this a bit. The question is, who have you empowered by telling their story? And if I could just expand that to me sounds a little bit like, tell us a little bit about that one story, that place, that person that had a deep impact on you, and you felt that your work as a journalist was really done on that story.
In the international setting, I can think of one story in particular. When we were in Kosovo, we had a local worker in our warehouse who had a daughter who was suffering from an eye cancer that was causing her to go blind. And they didn't have the infrastructure was all gone to heck, and there was not much by way of electricity. Just things were shambles, and it was not a place to get proper medical care for such a serious condition. And she had already lost sight and was losing sight in one eye, and danger was that it was going to spread to the other, and she'd be completely blind. So I was able to, and this is where I went what might be kind of crossing the line a little bit. I not only wrote about her as a journalist, but I kind of became an advocate for her as well, in which took up collection, helped her make contacts with people abroad. And in short, this young girl, I think she was 7 or 8, she was able to get some care at the NATO base there in Kosovo. They determined that they didn't have the capacity to take care of her. But through our reporting and our fundraising, we were able to get her in touch with a surgeon at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and pay her airfare over there, her and her mother, to fly over. We couldn't get her dad to go too. He had to work, and also weren't able to raise that much, but we're able to get her there, and they were able to save her one eye. She did go blind in the eye that was already affected, but they were able to save her sight. And just, I don't know, that one stuck with me as just really meaningful on a personal level.
Because it is very meaningful, Matt. Thanks for sharing that with us. Here's a question about the craft a bit. Question, what strategies do you use to consolidate information and write?
Well, it's a process. You talk to as many people as you possibly can. And once you think you know everything that there is about a subject, you call another 5 people, because there's always something else you got to learn. And then once you've gathered as much information about a topic as you possibly can with the experts who know this well, people who've written studies, with the people who this affects, and that's the main thing. Is you don't want to just talk to talking heads like I'm appearing to you, but you want to talk to who are these policies affecting? Who on the ground is it affecting? And you talk to those people that might have to live with whatever policies or what's the result of that. And you talk to all these people, and you're taking your notes, and you can have a volume of notes like this. And then the first thing I do after that, when I need to write, and I told you writing just is hard, trying to compress all that, I imagine that I'm in a bar and I'm sitting next to my buddy Chris here, and we're having a non-alcoholic beverage, and I'm telling him the story. And so I just write it down like I would be telling it to a friend. Just all the way things that I have taken, I try to filter it through that way, and I try to turn it into some kind of something that someone else can relate to and understand, and make it so that someone can, it's something that you can digest. And then once I get that down, I'll start to fill in the gaps and the quotes and make sure, did I get that right? And do all the fact checking and everything. But I wanted to just flow just from the knowledge that I gained in learning this. And I wanted to flow into something that I can tell to a regular person. I'd be sitting next to a bar.
That's great advice. Great advice for any kind of writing, I'd say. Matt, you said you were in on our last session with General Clark, where I asked him, and I'm going to ask all of our guests this week a similar question. Again, you have this very unique experience whereby you have lived and worked overseas. You have lived in the United States and done work that is international. You have been in the United States and done domestic work. So your experience covers the kind of full enchilada that we're talking about this week. Based on that experience, Matt, why don't you share with us 1, 2, 3 qualities or characteristics that you think would stand out for either or both international journalism or simply working internationally?
Look, I'll skip the 1, 2, 3, and I'll tell you like this. I'm from a small town of Louisiana. All right. When I was growing up, the extent of my travels would be to visit, one set of grandparents in Texas and maybe a beach vacation in Biloxi, Mississippi. My universe was very small. I didn't get into the international scene until, reading Russian literature in high school. And then I wanted to see these places that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were writing about. And so I took the leap and I went there. I went to Russia to study abroad as an undergrad, and then went to the Peace Corps to the Soviet Union and really developed a love for that place. What I found was, and what I hold, today, is that experience. I thought that I thought that the world revolved around the United States of America. And I had an outsized idea of my place and America's place in the world. And going out there and living out there, or even just traveling out there, gives you that perspective, the real perspective of, it's like Galileo, there's the earth the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. And it gave me that perspective that, the world doesn't revolve around the United States, and it definitely doesn't revolve around me. We have a part to play, and it's a very important and influential part, but it's not the be all and end all for everyone, the world's citizens. It's important to have that perspective, and I think that I've benefited my entire life by stepping outside of American borders and seeing how the world works. And even if you don't work abroad as a journalist or live abroad as a Peace Corps volunteer or whatever you do, just travel. It's just so important to get that idea, that perspective of, what other people, what's important to other people, what are their priorities, and what gives them joy in life.
That's pure gold there, Matt. I couldn't agree with you more. Matt, we've got a few more minutes. I'm going to do another speed round of these very intelligent questions from Bozeman High students. So there's 3 questions. Let's do it in 3 or 4 minutes in order to get this thing in on time. Question 1, how long does it take on average to write a story?
Well, it depends on the story. If you're when I was working for the AP, I could write 6 stories in a day. and sometimes would have to when I'm covering politics. The position I'm in now, it can take months. So it's just a matter. You always want to have at least 2 sources for a story, just to make sure that you have different perspectives. But really, just if it's a topic worth doing, it can take months. It could take years. But if you're working for a daily, you don't have that luxury.
Question 2. How is journalism different while living in Helena versus New York City?
Well, in New York City, I didn't go to the I didn't get to go to the grocery store and have the sources I just written about come up to me and start yelling at me in the bread aisle. So that's one thing. But no, Montana journalism is very low, and people are very passionate. And it's one thing to be writing about the world from New York as the sun shines on all these places, and there's nothing like that. But it's another thing to write about and to be a part to report news where you consider your home, and you're writing about the things that affect not just the people of Montana, but you are a person of Montana, and it affects you and your family. So you got an interest in this, you got a stake in this. This is my home, and it's something that I care deeply about. And it's just reporting from home versus reporting on the world.
Okay, Matt, let's wrap up. This one's going to give you an opportunity to answer in many different ways. What is the most difficult part of being an international journalist?
It can be the isolation if you're hanging out your own shingle. That's why it's really important to build a network, to be a part of that community, because that loneliness of being away from what's familiar and your family and a lot of loved ones, that can be hard on long winter nights. But but there's always going to be that can be difficult, and you have to overcome that. Technical things aside, there's not always going to be a Starbucks for you to file your story. So you're going to have to figure out how you can be a one person, writing, filing, tech machine crew where in places where there's not necessarily the technical know-how. There are just all kinds of logistical challenges to doing this, and it takes it's not for everybody. It takes a certain adventurous character. You got to have a little grit, and you got to just be open to experiences and be able to roll with the punches. You're going to encounter some difficult times, but you just got to keep your head on your shoulders and really be smart about the way you're doing things.
Right on, Matt. I mean, that's good advice for I'm definitely for journalism, but I think in most respects, international careers, whatever you do. And that, it's just your answer there reminded me a bit of what Director Osterman said this morning. He would add to that a very good smattering of curiosity and adventurism, is always helpful in this. So, Matt, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on international journalism and the international work and international career. Let me quickly thank the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, First Interstate Bank, Trail West Bank, QFI, the High Stakes Foundation, and Longview Foundation, and Mr. Matt Volz coming to you live from Helena, our state capital. Thank you so much, Matt. If any of you students out there or people who are watching this missed any of our previous or our events to come over the next 4 days, please have a look on our YouTube channel. Matt, until then, you be well. Thank you again.
Thanks for the opportunity, Chris. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.